Hey everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us for this year's Virtual Visiting Scholar webinar. I'm Bethany Farmer, the ARC Network's Community Librarian, and today we are hosting a member of the 6th cohort of the Virtual Visiting Scholars program. This program empowers scholars to complete metasynthesis and meta-analysis of existing literature to address critical issues relevant to equity in STEM. Before we introduce today's guest, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items and a brief overview of the ARC network. First, I want to let you know this webinar is being recorded. We will share the recording with registrants and post it to our ARC network website. Live captioning is available through Zoom. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you will see a number of different menu options. To the right is the icon for captioning. Selecting the caret will allow you to customize your captioning. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. For the beginning of our webinar, you will only be able to view chat messages from the ARC team. We will also use the chat to share links to resources in our feedback survey. We will open the chat for participants once we finish with the prompted part of our discussion. If you have questions for the speakers, please add them to the Q&A. You can also upvote questions. I'll now pass it over to Dr. Heather Metcalf, the PI of the ARC Network and Managing Director of Research, Innovation, and Entrepreneurship for our home organization, WePan. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. I'd love to share a bit about the ARC Network as we get started on this webinar today. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate a broad community that bridges the gap between research and practice. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, and online events like this one. The ARC network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality. We strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that folks experience. The ARC network is funded through a cooperative agreement with the NSF Advanced Program with our home organization, the Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN. To learn more about the ARC network, we encourage you to visit equityandstem.org, where you can also join the community if you haven't already. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and hashtag Equity in STEM. Now I'll pass it over to ARC Network's Project Director, Virginia Rhodes, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm honored to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Brooke Coley, to share her work as a member of the 6th Virtual Visiting Scholar cohort. Just a little bit about Dr. Coley's background. She is the founding executive director of the Center for Research Advancing Racial Equity, Justice, and Socio-Technical Innovation and Engineering, Rare Justice, and an assistant professor of engineering at Arizona State University. Across several national projects funded primarily by the National Science Foundation, Dr. Coley's research lies at the intersection of racial equity, mental health, and qualitative research methods, encompassing critical theory, participatory action research, and arts-based research methods. Her work is anchored in an intentional amplification of the voices of minoritized populations in STEM, with the goal of informing disruption of the pervasive systemic inequities found in racialized organizations such as institutions of higher learning. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to hear about how your research has unfolded, Dr. Coley, and I will turn screen sharing over to you.
All right. Can everyone see that? Can you see the slide? All right, awesome.
Okay.
All right, let me just make sure because, it's academics, we need a timer, so I'm keeping track here. So good afternoon. My name is Dr. Brooke Coley. Thank you for the introduction, Virginia. It's great to be here. This project has been both an honor and a journey and a quest. And so I'm excited to share some of the work, and I say some because the work continues with you today. So before I get started, this is called Racing Against the Clock, a meta-analysis of publication timelines across STEM equity research and STEM education outlets. So my first two slides may be might repeat some information that was already mentioned, but I felt compelled to start here because of what the ARC network has become in my own professional world. I had the opportunity to engage a couple years ago when there was a meeting discussing how we could think about equity of STEM faculty as impacted by COVID, and sort of just brainstorming some of these considerations and having the opportunity to participate in that dialogue. It was at that time that I also learned about the virtual visiting scholars program, and definitely have my eyes out for when it would be announced for another cohort to apply. I was particularly interested because as you see these numbers, the ARC network starts to really focus in on tenure and equity amongst faculty, women faculty. And I want to, as a Black engineering faculty, I want to particularly look at that far right percentage, the 2.3% of women of color on the tenure track or tenured in STEM. There have been efforts, of the National Science Foundation, through Advance, through AGEP, and others, more recently racial equity, trying to attack this from many different angles. And so I'm hoping that the project that I shared today will be a bit unique and challenge our thinking. So one of the things that I particularly resonate with regarding the ARC network is these three pillars, focusing around intersectionality, intentionality, and inclusivity. And so as I go through these slides, hopefully I'll be able to help you see how I've tried to be intentional in incorporating those aspects into this project. The call to action to me came in the form of the VVS, the Virtual Visiting Scholarship. And I think this work is not only timely, it's a matter of equity, it's a matter of justice, and let's talk more about it. So let's go a little bit to some of the things we know. What do we know? Well, we know that there's been so much work already done, and yet there are still remaining unanswered questions. So when we think about Advance, this is a recent paper, I think it's from 2021, somewhat recent, where the different interventions, some of the different interventions that have been advanced through advanced projects was listed. And what I wanted to bring our attention to here were sort of the three buckets that these interventions have coalesced around. And those have been recruiting women in STEM, mentoring, networking, and professional development, and then also improving academic climate. But one thing that sort of shows up in the literature, but not to the extent and not to the nuance that hopefully we'll see is definitely warranted, is needing more focus on factors impacting metric attainment. And when I say metric attainment, I'm talking about the big beast, right? Tenure. And so tenure, the process of tenure and promotion is one of the hurdles that exists for women of color faculty in general, but women of color faculty specifically are disproportionately impacted by the policies, the procedures that sort of fall under the realm of tenure. So tenure is categorized by three buckets typically. I have these little icons here so that we can keep notice of how they show up. So when you think about teaching, you're in the classroom, it's your interaction with students, mentorship, which we heard on that last slide is one of the things that has actively been addressed through interventions. we know there's service. Those are those are a little mixed up, but service should be time instead of money. Service is time. What are you committing your time to? And for faculty that are minoritized, often a lot of those efforts of service are not counted or they go unnoticed. There's an additional labor that doesn't get accounted for. And then research, that tends to be grant dollars and publications. And so when we think about these metrics, we have to understand that all the pathways aren't necessarily created equal. And we need to dig into that a little bit more to see how the different processes might differentially be impacting particular groups by identity or even the work that they study. So here I have a graph. This is from Chin et al. And it's a paper that's talking about the systemic racial disparities in funding rates from the National Science Foundation. Now, I'm not going to go into this deeply, but what I wanted to show here is just that if you look at the bottom graph, I'm focused in this work on Black women faculty, and I'll explain a little more why later. But that blue line represents the difference in funding rate relative to the annual overall rate. So you can see that Black scholars are below this line, and that's kind of been true with some instability, but across the last 20 years. Another figure that I thought was really interesting took proposals and kind of showed out of proposals, awards, and funding rates broken down by race and ethnicity. And so again, if you look here, if you move from left to right, whites submitted 20,000 proposals, more than 20,000 proposals, with about 31% of those being funded. And then if you move over to the right, you see that Blacks or African Americans submitted 929 proposals. That's a drastically different order of magnitude, even though the percentage of funding is not, that's pretty comparable, but the magnitude of proposals being submitted is definitely worth noticing. We're talking about 20 times less submissions than whites. And so, if you go back and think about that tenure slide, teaching, service, research, right? So grant dollars, that's a significant part of the research. Service is probably one of the areas where, as I said, minoritized faculty are overloaded, overworked without recognition for all of those efforts. And so we see that there's a disparity in the funding, which is a part of the research, but the other part of that is publications. And so this work is specifically going to look at publications. And so here we have a figure that talks about the editor and editorial board background. And what I thought is most significant from this slide that I wanted to share, this is from Science Education. And if you look to the far right, you can see the different composition of the editorial boards by gender. You can see them by nationality. You can see them by ethnicity and race. And then to the far right, you see equity-centered research focus. And so this means that across the editorial boards, and I'm going to point out IJSE, International Journal of Science Education here, 13.33, which means that very few people on the editorial board have backgrounds in equity-centered research. And as we go through the presentation, I hope I'll be able to highlight why this matters. So in another paper by Avery et al., they talk about racial biases in the way that publications are processed. And this was starting to get very much aligned with the work I'm going to share today. So two of the facts that I wanted to share from them specifically highlight that racial biases are manifested in the ways research topics and samples are evaluated, right? So they have already stated in their work that these biases have been seen based on how the works are evaluated. They also said that racial bias can be expressed in responses to research samples that diverge from the Western norm, right? And so, or even if it's not related to race and diversity, when it deviates from whatever is our normalized way of knowing, then that work experiences bias. So where am I going with all this? Well, I want to share a quote from that. It says, this is not just an unfortunate side effect of what researchers happen to be interested in. It arguably reflects the reality that people, who are not on the receiving end of racial biases may underestimate the importance of the research problem. So if we go back to looking at that editorial board composition, folks are not, many of the folks don't have background or in equity scholarship. And so this quote shows that we have to think about how people's vantage impacts or positions their ability to review the work, to value the work, or even to see the importance of the work. And the takeaway from this is the myriad manifestations through which minoritized scholars endure costs for equity work remain underexplored in the literature. So some of these I've had to piecewise across fields, but in STEM specifically, we know a lot about experiences, and we're by day we are learning more. However, we know very little about the actual way that the metrics are attained as it relates to minoritized identity and also work that advances equity scholarship. And in addition to that, we know that what you study and where matters. And I say that because we know that here in this figure, this was I think this was from 22, so this might be, I'm sure this has evolved since then, but what it was showing was the anti-critical race theory efforts across the US, with those kind of being signed into law in the blue, and those proposed in the purple. So even at that state in 2022, this was sort of pervasive across the US. And so who can study what where? There's definitely an influence that we cannot ignore. So racing against the clock. Now we're going to step into actually unpacking the project. And so I want to show you that this work is intersectional in that it considers oppression and power as impacted by race, ethnicity, and additional axes of marginalized identity. This work is intentional. VVS was the call to action, and this work will specifically consider factors impacting STEM faculty equity. And this work is inclusive, focusing on metrics impacting the most marginalized for the benefit of all. And so in terms of intersectionality, have a focus on Black women STEM faculty. The intentionality is the end product of having actual empirical evidence in Black and white. And it's inclusive because we're going a little bit deeper here to think about metrics and with publications as a metric. So the research question underpinning this work was, I wanted to know how does the pursuit of work along the continuum of equity impact the time to publication in STEM education research outlets? So specifically, if you think, we all know that there's some efforts that are a little more palatable. I think that's the word we all know to code. And that might be on one end of the continuum. And then there's the other extreme, like it could be work that's really disruptive, novel, transformative, forcing accountability, introducing a new way of knowing and doing and being. And so I really wanted to see if we could capture what that looks like in an actual empirical way to gain a deeper insight for what this might inform for those that are back to those three bubbles from tenure, research, service, teaching. The theoretical framing. So for this work, I have anchored the work in race theory of racialized organizations. And I'll just go through this just a little bit because I think it's actually really important to understand why I've chosen that framing. So race theory of racialized organizations, if you have not read it, I highly advised. It is one of the most useful tools in understanding the manifestations of racism in higher education environments or institutions in general. It's based on 4 tenets, with those 4 tenets being represented here in these squares. So the unequal distribution of resources. Here, I see that as potentially, if you think about that metric or that the data from that table where the editorial board members didn't really have a background in equity, then this, to me, I see that as a resource, because when you're submitting your manuscript to a particular journal, if that journal doesn't have a vast body of representation or reviewers with expertise in your area, then in that sense, that is a resource, right? So there's an unequal distribution of resources. That also relates to whiteness as a credential. Whiteness as a credential, if we go back and looked at the race and ethnicity of those boards, they are primarily white. And so in that sense, representation, a lack of diverse representation on editorial boards, and even those perhaps serving as reviewers for specific journals, is one of the ways that we can think about that in this realm. Racialized decoupling is the tendency to think about policy, but separate from race. And so while this work is not looking at race directly, it is sort of identifying a proxy by looking at those that are advancing equity work, as many of the individuals advancing equity work hold minoritized identities. And that is published in the literature. And diminished agency. I have the little sad face because there's nothing like getting a paperback that was misunderstood, where your frame of reference, where your cultural epistemology that was applied wasn't deemed as worthy because it just was different than the accepted way of doing and knowing. And so we will see when we get into the data how these underpinning tenets really come through and give us some insight for moving forward. This work is also anchored in intersectionality, and I've been involved in many conversations of late. I don't know if Carrie Ann is on this, but we've been talking about intersectionality a lot. And here, I think it's important because we want to consider how oppression is experienced as a function of race and. I think a lot of times we've been using intersecting identities or people that are at the intersection of multiple minoritized identities, but that's still very different than intersectionality, which necessitates the inclusion and consideration of race and ethnicity. I have Polly Murray here because a lot of folks are aware of Kimberly Crenshaw sort of coining the term intersectionality. But if you go back and do a little digging, intersectionality really originated much earlier. And Polly Murray was one of the sort of pioneering thinkers thinking about gender, sexuality, and race at this intersection. And in modern day, Polly Murray would probably be identified as non-binary. They were having a very, maybe like ahead of her time with that back in her time when she became the first law student, female law student at Howard University. And so this work was instrumental with women's rights. Their work was instrumental in Brown v. Board of Education. And so this is also weaved into this as we think about STEM faculty of color. All right, so moving into the data, I want to tell you, I always feel it's important to mirror real life or lived experience. So we're going to navigate a case as we unpack this data on the publication timelines. So I want you to meet Dr. Amara. She is pre-tenure. She's at year 3 on the tenure track. She's a STEM faculty and the only Black woman faculty in her program. She produces STEM equity scholarship primarily. And at the time, she has only 4 of 10 journal publications required, of the 10 required for tenure and promotion. And on December 10th, 2020, Dr. Imara submits a manuscript to the flagship journal in her field. Okay, and we'll come back and see the status of Dr. Imara. For this work, I conducted it in 4 phases. One was getting the data from different journal outlets, STEM education journal outlets. The second part was to code using R and a categorization of manuscripts based on where they fell along this equity continuum. Then the analysis, calculating the times to publication and performing the appropriate statistical testing, and then reporting findings and figuring out what that data implied. So I want to show that originally I had, I thought that I was going to include 11 different STEM education outlet journals in the analysis. But what I soon learned after kind of really getting into the work was that it wasn't going to be possible, because in order to conduct this research, to do this analysis, there's some pertinent information that you need for each manuscript that's going to be included in your volume. And so that's the date that it's submitted, the date that it's revised, and the date that it's accepted. And so this was essentially my first learning experience in the project, in that what I thought was basic transparent information that would be provided to authors is not necessarily available in all of the STEM education outlets. In fact, of the list that I had, it is only available, or was only available in 4. And so what that looks like, so this is a snapshot from an article in the Journal of Engineering Education, which is where in a second I'll explain a little bit more. But if you see here, on each manuscript, it has the date that it's received, the date that it's revised, and the date that it's accepted. And so these journals here in this list do not contain that information. Some may have the date it was received, some may just put the date it's accepted, but in order to conduct this analysis, we need both. And so, and for additional analyses that I'm doing, sort of separate from this main focus, is it also requires needing the revised date. So that downsized the original pool of data for the study. So what I ended up doing was I wanted to go through the full process with one journal initially, just to sort of work out the kinks, make sure that this was in fact the way I wanted to analyze the data, and that it yielded the things that I was looking for and was effective, before spending the time to sort of start with multiple journals, because it can be very time consuming. Each code that's developed has to be customized to the journal because of where the information is physically located on the manuscript. It does not require, it's not as exhaustive as the initial time that the code is created, but it is still a challenge. And you find things like typos, and sometimes the journal changes just randomly from one volume to a next, or maybe from the year. As an example here, JEE, it was only in 2019 when they started having all of the data available. So originally I was going to do from 2014 to 2024, but the 2014 to 2018 data did not have the date information. So these 6 years are included in this analysis. It goes from volumes 108 through 113. It includes 208 manuscripts. So JEE produces 4 volumes per year, each one containing about 10 manuscripts. So that's 40. And, over the course of the six years, this includes 208. In a data table, for each of these, I had the manuscript title, the first author, the institution of the lead author, those dates that we talked about, the abstract and keywords. I used R to create a code to initially do a date extraction, and then ANOVA to compare timelines across different categories. So so here I think is important to explain how I define the continuum of equity. And so here you kind of see these two axes. One is thinking about criticality, the other is thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. And so I came to wanting to know, one, is a paper critical? Because if you follow me back to that original quote that I shared, one of the things there was that critical is not only when it involves race, but it can also be when it's introducing something new or something that goes against or expands or challenges our existing way of knowing and doing. And so critical in my defining was work that advances new ways of doing engineering through the creation of tools, theories, conceptual frameworks, approaches, etc. These works expand the base of knowledge for the scholarly community. And DEI was categorized as explicitly addressing minoritized identity and/or associated ideals, such as sense of belonging or social justice. So the four categories, I came up with a binary code, and basically if a manuscript, so these sort of serve as buckets. You can kind of think of them as buckets. And so now with my 208 manuscripts, I had to manually place them in each of the buckets. They had to find a home in one of the buckets. And no manuscript could go in two buckets, which was a headache because sometimes it's just a matter of judgment. And so I will note that as one limitation. It's very possible that what I might consider critical, another scholar looking at this could have a different placement of that. And so not only does that speak to the importance of the researcher lens in these types of efforts, particularly when using algorithms and things that have to be trained, models that have to be trained with human coding first, that's definitely a consideration. So I'll talk about that at the very end, just future efforts. I will be coding these with multiple raters so that we can get a efficiency of how accurate our bucket placement is. That will help us to make sure that the model is as accurately predicting the placements of additional manuscripts moving forward. So the four buckets are critical, DEI only. Critical and DEI means it's a critical thing that addresses a DEI topic, and then neither critical nor DEI. And so here, I just want to, I don't know if you all can talk or kind of chime in the chat, but here are four different titles that were actual real titles in my data set. And so for the sake of time, I want to let's look at the top left corner. Learning from the experiences of Navajo engineers, looking toward the development of a culturally responsive engineering curriculum. I don't know if I can see the chat. Oh yeah, I can see the chat. Would anybody take a guess at where you think that one will be placed? What would you consider that title? Learning from the experiences of Navajo engineers. Oh, I got somebody in the chat. Let's see. DEI, critical and DEI. Definitely DEI, probably critical. So this is great. I love this because you can see that just what I mentioned. It's subject to who's looking at it, so it's open to interpretation. But this one actually would be placed critical and DEI. So whoever said that is correct. And then for the sake of the others, I will show you this one, interdisciplinary engineering education, a review of vision, teaching and support is neither critical nor DEI. This one, choosing an engineering major, a conceptual model of student pathways into engineering, that would be critical only. And this one, divergent thinking and academic performance of students with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, characteristics in engineering, we would classify that one as DEI only. So back to our case. So Dr. Amara on May 18, 2022, received the second iteration of feedback on the manuscript. It included the comment that language is counter to traditional higher education and engineering environments, and in fact, might be deemed unprofessionalism. Explain why you use such language and why it is needed when traditional research frowns upon such informality. And so again, we're ebbing back and flow, right, from the manuscripts to this case study that we're following. But if you go back to the original date, we were in December 2020. So now we're in a second iteration and it's May 18, 2022. And we're still getting comments that questioning the professionalism because of the choice of a different terminology. All right. So now let's talk about the findings. What did we get? Well, if you look here, what I want you to focus in on this slide is that as you look down the buckets, so critical, DEI, critical and DEI, and neither critical nor DEI, you see that the greatest number of observations, which means the greatest number of papers in that subset, that data set, were neither critical nor DEI. So more than half, okay? And so that has something to do with what we'll see in terms of the statistics, but I just wanted to point that out, that and the critical and DEI are the lowest populated bucket. All right. And so here we actually have the graphs, bar plots of the time to publication in days across the buckets. And you can see here, the takeaway is very simple. Critical and critical plus DEI take longer. And the variability of theirs is also greater, which is significant. These were the results from the ANOVA, which found that there was a significant difference from the critical bucket from the others. However, DEI and also critical plus DEI were not found to be significant. Now, this is not because those delays aren't significant. This is because of the power of the sample. And so this will be addressed as moving forward as I expand the data to include those additional journals with more, to have more, a greater N of manuscripts for consideration. Here, I wanted to show you, just highlight a few manuscripts that were critical and DEI to help you see the time course for those specific publications. So you can see we're ranging here from 761 days. You know, I'm trying to do my math real quick. I think that's 2 years, 730, something like that, right? 365. You know, from 2 years plus to almost 3 years here. And if you look at the titles, we've got something talking about political identity. We've got something that's talking about Black students, Latinx students, resisting, and then learning and creating something new, right? So learning something and creating something new about a specific minoritized group, and that's speaking to Indigenous engineers. So this graph is the same. It's just showing those titles, and so it's sort of like as you go from left to right, it's just more days, as it's just another way of representing that same table. Now, I want to go back to the case because now we're on February 22nd, 2023, and Dr. Amara submitted the third revision of the manuscript. And in this manuscript, she included a statement that said, "We wish to advance the ideals of Black intellectualism in engineering education. As such, in alignment with our commitment to the integrity of modeling anti-racist research practices, we prioritize our commitment to our community members. These choices elongated our timeline, reduced our own productivity, and required us to create additional justification for our approaches to our broader engineering education research community. We anchor our work in the spirit of rigorous researchers who push themselves beyond convenience, opportunism, and the easy way out." So in this case, Dr. Imara was being compliant with the reviews, but also pushing back. That was resistance as an author, to hold to the ideals, even at the cost of the time, the additional time for review. So the takeaways from this are that intersectional topics do, in fact, take longer to publish, those at the intersection of critical and DEI. This highlights how inequities impact the acquisition of essential metrics. There was very high variability with the different buckets, which represents or is an indicator that there's systemic barriers there. And these delays will inadvertently disproportionately affect those on the tenure track who are pursuing the work that's at those intersections. And here I wanted to use this figure because I was thinking it's not balanced. We are essentially comparing apples and oranges. So just sit with, is there equity when one faculty's paper can be published in 149 days and another faculty in that same journal can take 1,538 days? I think that's something we really need to address. And so some of the ways that I would recommend that we could do that is by increasing transparency in the journal process. I think that maybe it should be a minimal requirement that those dates are available. That's often how authors, particularly early scholars, start finding the journals that they want to advance their work. And a lot of them do look at those dates. They look on the website to see the suggested timelines that are kind of general for the given journal. But if you had that for each manuscript, then someone could easily look for work that's relative to their own and kind of get an idea. It's not a guarantee, but at least an idea could be very helpful for people trying to stage their productivity, because you're on a tenure clock. And as Dr. Amara had 10 publications, she had 6 to go. And so the time is critical. Institutions could also tailor institutional metrics to go beyond thinking discipline specific, but maybe even topical area within discipline. Because again, we've seen apples and oranges. Expanding reviewer expertise pools in DEI topics so that those percentages that we saw on that table could go up. We need more people that have expertise, a foundation in these areas to accurately and adequately and timely review scholarship. We could also develop policies around continuity of reviewers so that, if a paper goes back, it's not going to fresh eyes. Maybe that can't be the case because of bandwidth for all, but maybe particularly when it comes to the critical and DEI type papers, that is a policy that sort of builds in a buffer for how those would be handled at the time. And then also thinking about tenure policies that consider the full context of publication. So could you document this process? Could we document Dr. Imara's process instead of only listing the publications that are final and published? All right, so there were some limitations to the work. One was that I only focused on published manuscripts. So I don't know if, those that were submitted and then rejected and not further pursued, those that just never were finalized, or either those that started in one journal and eventually got published in another journal. I wouldn't be able to track those. And there's limited insight here into the journal editorial decision-making and team positioning. So future work, as I said, I'm going to run the current analysis on the additional journals which will move from about 200 papers to now have more than 1,000 manuscripts. And so that power is definitely going to be in the analyses. And so I'm looking forward to see what comes out there. I'll also be doing natural language processing leveraging natural language processing to see if more contextualized representation of the manuscripts yield similar results. So as opposed to bucketing these manuscripts on the continuum of equity, if we use the context of the abstract, does that better enable us to make these categorizations and do the same data outcomes uphold? And then I think this is really important in fostering stakeholder awareness and accountability. So I can see this needing to be a conversation not only with journals and editorial boards, but also deans and administrators and people engaged in decision-making for the tenure process of faculty. More racing, there's more racing to do. So in January, this analysis will be finalized with the other 3 journals added in. In February, I'm actually going to submit this work for a Building Capacity in STEM Education Research grant, leveraging, expanding my own knowledge in natural language processing and machine learning. In 2025, in March 2025, I'm currently working on a manuscript that's going to go to the Journal of Higher Ed. And I'm hoping to propose a faculty workshop for STEM equity at the STEM equity convening. Last thing, so we got to close the case, right? So guilty, the case was me. The case was actually my story of a paper that I started at that time in my tenure process. And it took 812 days for that paper to be accepted. But that paper was awarded the William Elgin Wickenden Award from the American Society for Engineering Education. And so why I wanted to include that case is because I'm hoping that that will be inspirational for someone, because delayed is not denied. There are other future award winners and just, scholars that may be deterred in this elongated process of critique and iteration. It's not fair, it's definitely not equitable, and we need to do something about it. So with that, I'll say thank you, and that's my time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coley. And this has been just amazing to see your work and see where you've come from since you began last year. I do want to let the attendees know that the chat is open as well as Q&A for anyone who has any questions. And while we wait for that, I can ask you my own questions. So
Sure.
you had shared your own journey through this and how your own research was delayed, as you said. And I wondered if you might have any words of advice or wisdom for folks who may be experiencing the same thing in their own research doing critical DEI work.
Yeah, I thank you, Virginia. Thank you for that question. That's a great question. I struggled because I didn't know originally. I'm like, I should stick to the project. I should stick to the data. But I wanted to be transparent. I wanted to be vulnerable. I wanted to share because I know my tenure packet is under review right now. So I'm very much familiar with that process and the way that it can weigh on your psyche. I think the advice I would give is folks really have to reckon with what it is they want as a scholar. Is it the recognition? Is it tenure that is your priority? Or is it your commitment to your work? Is it having the impact in the community? Is it speaking truth to power? Is it putting forth language until people are willing to recognize it as professional, or challenging these notions? And so depending on where you fall in answering that will really depend on what that process is. And for me, that quote that I shared, I wanted to put that in the paper because I thought it was important that folks knew those were the decisions I made as someone that couldn't afford them if I was going by the tenure, the demands of the tenure track. But I sacrificed that, right? That paper was almost 2.5 years. And so if there's a quantity that you have to produce, which at my institution at the time was 10. And so if you have to have a quantity and it's taken 2.5 or 3 years per paper, you don't have that time, right? And most people aren't working on more than 1 or 2 manuscripts at a time, because on the other side of manuscripts, you got to be writing grants and getting the money. So it really is creating a mission impossible. And so I think it's important that institutions know that. I think it's important that the decision makers know that, so that the onus doesn't fall solely on the individual to have to make that kind of choice. Because to me, it's a decision, not decision. Like I don't want to compromise the integrity of my work, but the average person also doesn't want to be not competitive for tenure. So it's like you just don't have that you don't have that flexibility. And so I took a gamble. I took a gamble, and I held to my values, and that will always be my recommendation, is just to hold to your values, and whatever is meant to be will be. And in my case, maybe that's tenure, maybe not, but that was just something that I had to come to and be okay with. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing. And I think that's something I really took away from those recommendations you listed, was that you're not putting the onus on the faculty member. It's on the editorial boards. It's on the universities. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat or anything. Let's see. Lots of thank yous and appreciations.
All right, that's great. Well, if there's anyone that I know from the convening, there were a few folks out there doing synergistic work, related work. I would love to converse. This work is, I call this like my iceberg project, because after this, it actually uncovered so much more work to be done. What I thought was going to be a easy in and out question has actually kind of carved out a space. And so I would love to talk to others and engage. I know this time is limited, but I'm here, and feel free.
Yeah, I'm reading this comment here, trying to shorten it a little bit for you.
Okay.
This person was saying how they're swamped with their tenure review responsibilities. They're also interfering with their capacity to say yes to review invitations. And while they've been trying to change tenure processes at her institution to value and elevate critical and anti-racist work, they're also declining invitations to review manuscripts about similar work. As well as writing your own work is always valued more than reviewing others' work in that tenure process. And they'd want to know if you know any other places or fields that might have found effective ways to kind of address this issue.
So I was trying to read that. I don't read quickly, so I couldn't catch up. So thanks for reading that or summarizing that, Virginia. And Allison, I think it is, I want to give credence to your question. So I'm going to say right now, I am aware of a couple of recent studies. Actually is very interesting. One of my mentors in the ARLS Academic Research Leadership Symposium, which is very much the Black faculty, postdocs affiliated with the National Society of Black Engineers. It kind of, we meet like co-located with the NSBE convention. Anyway, they sent out to our listserv this new paper. And the reason it connects to your question is because the paper is talking about, it's like USA trends on tenure disproportionately affect minority faculty. And the interesting part is, in the paper, they actually talk about some of these things that you just raised in your question, like balancing these priorities. How do you show up for other responsibilities? And, where do you say yes or no as it relates to your own responsibilities? And this paper was sent to us by this very senior person in our field, and it said, read this because you need this as your back pocket avocation tool. And so I would like to talk to you more to tell you some things that I'm aware of, but there are some studies that have been done that are kind of thinking about these things, but it's still limited. But I will share what I am aware of.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Metcalf, who can close us out here today. And thank you again, Dr. Coley, for your amazing work.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that amazing presentation and for all of the hard work that you've done on this project, and for sharing your own experience. I think it adds just a richness to the research that you've done that is very compelling. So thank you. I also love seeing you get to connect with Allison, who is one of our early cohort members of the Virtual Visiting Scholar program too. And so seeing your projects connect and your efforts connect in that way is really wonderful to witness. So thank you for being part of the Virtual Visiting Scholar program and for all of the work that you've done. Thank you to our attendees for spending time with us today. Ashley dropped the link in the chat to Dr. Coley's full report, which is located on the ARC Network website. We also have a couple of announcements that we'll make as we're closing out. It's very helpful when our webinar attendees provide feedback for us. So we're going to drop the link in the chat for a brief survey about your experience on today's webinar, and we would love to hear from you there. There's also space to suggest future topics of interest. So please take a look at that. We will also be hosting our next and final cohort 6 Virtual Visiting Scholar member, Dr. Jess Gold, on December 12th at 3 p.m. Eastern. And Ashley is also dropping the registration link in the chat. So we hope that you join for Dr. Gold's project on bringing the people back in, a meta-analysis of equity workers and academic institutions, a very timely topic as well. I also wanted to mention that the call for proposals for the 2025 Advanced Equity and STEM Community Convening is currently open through December 16th. The link in the chat gives you more information about the call for proposals. If you are doing equity-related work, whether it's research or practice, we would love to see you submit a proposal and share your work with the community at this convening. And with that, we hope that you have a really great rest of your week and a restorative weekend, and hope to see you again for our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.